Well, thank you very much, Clive. I'm going to share screen and hope that it works. Well, are we seeing my screen, Clive?
All good.
Thank you. Well, a very good evening, everyone. Thank you for tuning in on such a hot evening. We've got a different kind of Bible talk this evening, God willing. The subject is, it makes sense to believe that God exists. Now, as a Bible talk, normally I would point therefore to some of the unique features about the Bible which help us in this regard, such as the daring claims that the Bible makes. It claims to be the word of God, that it can save people from death and impart saving knowledge in what it is telling people. It has a unity in diversity. No other book has been written in quite the same way, yet despite its unparalleled diversity and its unique history of formation, written by many writers over millennia, it has an amazing consistency, coherence, and singleness of purpose. I might point to the accuracy of preservation, that the text that we have and that we use in our modern day reflects the text as it existed long ago, close to when it was originally written. We look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, we look at the Codex Sinaiticus. I don't know if you can see me as well as the screen, but there's a part of the Codex Sinaiticus behind me. All texts that testify to the accurate preservation of the Word of God down the ages, the fact that it has survived miraculously and is so widely available to us now against all the odds. We could point to fulfilled prophecy, the fact that the Bible makes predictions about historical events which were yet future, such as the bringing back of Israel to the land of Israel, something which seemed impossible even 100 years ago, has happened. Fulfilled Bible prophecy. We could talk about the explanatory power of the Bible. I do believe that the Bible has an explanatory power, that it provides a logical and credible explanation of why the world is the way it is, of what human nature is and what has gone wrong. And an explanation which many feel is the most compelling way of understanding ourselves and our world. The Bible explains the emptiness and lack of purpose which men and women sometimes feel in today's world. And it tells us what we need to do in order to put things right and get back into a good relationship with God. And every reader has to decide whether there is another book or another theory out there which fits the facts so well. And although I would like to talk at length about the Bible, about any of those subjects that you see on the screen right now, although those features, given that the Bible claims to be a book from God, although those features are helpful in the question of the existence of God, and they are, if we're talking about whether it makes sense that God exists, then we have to make other arguments too. We have to make arguments based on reason and not appealing to an authority, to scripture, to revelation. Having said that, I do believe it's possible for people to believe that God exists, that it makes sense to them without argument, which is to say that they don't need a reasoned argument. And we'll come to this at the very end of our thoughts. So I think that is the case. But nevertheless, argument can be helpful in defending that claim that God exists and that it makes sense that he does. And that's what we're going to be doing this evening, God willing. So where to begin with a subject like this? Well, two things, first of all. Making sense. Making sense is quite a subjective phrase, isn't it? You know, what makes sense to you might not make sense to me, and what makes sense to me might not make sense to someone else. It's quite subjective. So what am I doing? Well, I'm speaking as someone who believes that God exists, and I'm explaining why believing that God exists makes sense to me. My sense and my knowledge is what it is at present. And so the arguments I make sense to me. Second point, I'm speaking about topics this evening in which I'm not an expert. The only subject I can speak to as anything like an expert is ophthalmology, and even then only a small subset of ophthalmology, which is neuro-ophthalmology and ocular motility, eye movements. I can speak to those subjects with some expertise and regularly do to any audience, but away from those, I don't have any expertise. So please give me some license this evening to speak a little on subjects about which I don't know the same amount. Hopefully you'll give me that license. But whilst we're there, ophthalmology provides the ground, I think, to start with and for a restating of my first point about what makes sense to one person might not make sense to another. When we consider the human eye, now I'm going to show you a screen here. Please don't log off. Please don't turn away or leave the room. I'm not going to go through this in huge detail. This is just a screen of an OCT. It's a picture. It's an infrared picture of the retina at the back of the eye. And please don't worry about it. I know it looks like my Monday morning has invaded your Sunday evening, but I'm just going to make a little point about the eye to begin with. And this screen really, I don't know if you can see my mouse moving on the screen. Hopefully you can. That'll really help for me to explain this part. But what we see here are the back of the eye, the different layers of the retina, and there are many, many. If we make it a bit nicer to look at here, this is the eye, and the light comes in the eye through the cornea and the lens and the vitreous. And this film at the back of the eye, this yellow film, is a layer of nervous tissue. It's the retina, which I'm sure we've all heard of. And it's basically what we see with. And if you just look at that little yellow strip there, I really hope you can see my mouse, otherwise it's not helpful. But that expanded out here is the retina, all the different layers of the retina. I wonder, Clive, could you just tell me whether you can see my mouse point or not? It might guide me in terms of whether to move it or not. Yes, you can. Excellent. Thank you very much. Oh, and I can see myself briefly there as well. That's useful too. So here are the layers of the retina. The only point I want to make here is that the light comes in, and the part of the retina that sees the light are these photoreceptors here, these rods and cone cells, and they convert the light into an electrical signal. And the electrical signal travels through other cells all the way up until they enter these wires, which carry the electrical impulse, the nerve fibers. And these nerve fibers form a layer. It's the top layer. It's this bright layer at the top here, the first thing we see. And the RPE, the retinal pigment epithelium, nourishes the rods and cones, provides oxygen, energy, and so on. And there's loads of blood behind it, the choroid. But there's also blood throughout these layers, throughout the cells. That's why you can get hemorrhages. That's why you can get bleeds in them. And so why am I talking about this? Well, the problem here, and it's been known for a long time, is that the light coming into our eyes has to travel through the cables, through the blood vessels and the cells before it gets to the part of the eye that sees. So if you imagine an analogy of a television, it's a bit like having a television screen, and the cables are coming out of the screen. They're coming out of the front, and then they're looping around the TV to go back to the socket, because all these cables eventually head for the hole, the optic disc, and they form the optic nerve that runs back to the brain. And so what's happening here is that the cables are sticking out the front, and the light is having to come through the cables, the nerve fibers, through the blood vessels to hit the photoreceptors. And when my colleagues, some of my colleagues, look at that, they say, this is poorly designed. It's obvious, isn't it, that the cables should be at the back. They should come out the back. And in fact, they can. So if you look at a cephalopod's eye here, this is a vertebrate. This is the human eye. The light comes in. It has to go through the cables, through the blood vessels and the cells to hit the photoreceptors, to hit the screen. And the cables are coming out the front. It doesn't have to be that way. In cephalopods' eyes underwater, the photoreceptors are pointed directly at the light, and the cables come out the back, which might seem the right way to do it. So some of my colleagues who are atheists look at the eye and say, well, it's badly designed, and that's because it's just been cobbled together over time, natural selection acting on random mutation, until eventually it just ended up this way. It didn't have to be that way, could have been another way. It's not very well designed. But when you learn more about this setup, it's quite interesting, because the light that hits a cephalopod eye underwater doesn't contain what the light that hits our eyes does, which is ultraviolet radiation from the sun. They don't have to worry about ultraviolet radiation coming in, because it's not there, whereas we do. And actually, ultraviolet radiation is filtered out by the nerve fibers and the blood vessels and the cells, so that when it gets to the rods and the cones, it's diminished. So actually, although we might say it doesn't make sense for the cables to stick out the front, it does have an incredibly beneficial purpose. With this arrangement, oxygen and nutrients can also be supplied directly to the most metabolically active part of the eye, the rods and cones, because all the blood is here and they're right near the RPE. So the blood is right there. So actually the blood vessels filter the UV. Underwater eyes don't need UV protection. If the human eye was inverted, then blindness would ensue because of the ultraviolet exposure. So what am I saying? Well, I'm saying that I look at the eye and I see design. I see wonder. I see the hand of God. My colleague looks at the eye and sees poor design and sees evidence that there is no designer. I find it highly improbable that with no forethought, no intelligence, no thought whatsoever of the end result, I find it highly improbable that mutation could result in the construction of the eye with its staggering complexity. So there we have it. We have two equally intelligent people looking at exactly the same thing, understanding it, and coming to completely different philosophical conclusions about it. And that's why, for me, I don't think that biology is as fruitful an area to look at for this subject as certain others are. I do think it is fruitful, but I'm going to move on to talk about other things as well. So what we're going to do is reflect on some puzzling facts about the world and life. We're going to look at mysteries which need explaining. Multiple explanations are put forward, and what I'm saying is that the God explanation is the best. Facts that were previously mysterious make sense when we assume the existence of God, or they make better sense than any other explanation. We have to weigh the two against each other, and my contention is that the atheist explanation flounders when confronted with these facts. There are good arguments for the existence of God. And so that I can mention several of them, I'm going to be a little bit brief on some of them. In fact, I might be so brief as to skip over some altogether. This really is a presentation where seeing people's faces is incredibly helpful, because I know whether to move on, or I know whether people have glazed over, whether I'm glazing over myself. So I haven't got that feedback. So I'm basically going to talk about at least two, maybe three, maybe four arguments, in addition to what we've been talking about, that mean that, to me, believing that God exists makes sense. We were talking just now, weren't we, about biology. Now, evolution is put forward as an effort to explain the presence of life on the planet. But of course, evolution does not explain the presence of life on the planet. Darwin knew that. Evolution attempts to explain the supposed transition from one form of life to another. Now, that's very different from accounting for life itself. Just consider the cell. So this is a pictorial explanation, representation of what the cell looks like. It's from a medical textbook, something that's useful for educating those who need to know about cells. The cell is, we now know, a kind of supercomputer. It's of a level of complexity. Richard Dawkins calls it a kind of digital computer. Now, the cell can't have evolved because evolution presupposes the existence of the cell. Evolution requires the presence of a cell which already has the capacity to reproduce itself, that for evolution to then work, for random mutations to happen as reproduction occurs, and then natural selection on beneficial mutations and so on. So the cell has to be there to start with. But the point is, how did the cell get there to start with? How did this supercomputer come into existence? And the idea that random molecules in a warm pond, for example, through a bolt of lightning, could have assembled a cell is the same as saying that a bolt of lightning in a warm pond could also assemble a car or a skyscraper. It's a preposterous thing. And Richard Dawkins knows it's preposterous. And therefore, when he was asked, how did life come originally, he said, maybe aliens brought it from another planet. Now, it's ridiculous, but in a way, it's the best explanation he could come up with without an intelligent creator, because you can't account for its existence otherwise. So there it is, the first point. That's simply it, the mystery of the cell. How did it come into being? I'll just leave that one with you there. Let's go from the small scale to the enormous scale and think about the cosmos, the universe. Have you ever asked yourself, why is there a universe? And apparently this is one of those kinds of questions that college students, university students get to talking about and discussing in the early hours of the morning. I think I missed that. We never talked about this in the early hours, and probably hadn't really occurred to me, until recent years. Why is there something instead of nothing? Why something instead of nothing? Well, up until the 20th century, the prevailing viewpoint among both philosophers and scientists was that the universe is eternal, that matter and energy have always existed, that the universe never began to exist, and therefore it seemed that there was no need for a creator of the universe, it's just always been here. Well, that worldview crumbled under the impact of Einstein's general theory of relativity and the application of that theory to questions of cosmology. He said that the universe cannot be static, eternal, and timeless. It must be either expanding or collapsing. And his theory, and it was just a theory at first, predicted that the universe, even time and even space themselves, must have had a beginning at some point in the past, some point in the finite past. And it was only a theory. But during the 1920s, when telescopes got really good, observational astronomy began to uncover evidence that this theory was right, that the purely theoretical predictions that Einstein's theory had made were borne out, so that today the prevailing view among contemporary cosmologists is that the universe is not in fact infinite in the past, but that time and space are finite, not infinite, and that they came into being at some point a finite time ago. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that there must have been a cause for the universe. David Hume, who was a skeptic, Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, makes a useful point that there is no event that occurs without a cause. all material objects that have a beginning have a cause. Well, the universe is a material object that has a beginning, so it must have a cause. Something must have caused it to be. Now, what caused it? Well, whatever causes something cannot be the thing itself. A material object doesn't cause itself. It is caused by something outside it. So if we're thinking about the material universe, then whatever caused it has to be outside it, has to be outside the material universe. P.C.W. Davis, Paul Davis, professor at Arizona State University, said the coming into being of the universe, as discussed in modern science, is not just a matter of imposing some sort of organization upon a previously incoherent state, but literally the coming into being of all physical things from nothing. And the cause must be beyond space and time, not physical and not material. Now, this puts the atheist in a very awkward position, because the atheist viewpoint must hold that the universe came from nothing and by nothing. And surely that doesn't make sense, because out of nothing comes nothing, isn't it? Why does the universe exist instead of just nothing? There must have been a cause which brought the universe into being, and the cause must be outside the thing itself, outside of the physical and the material. Now, do you know anything that exists outside the physical and the material? Well, there's only really two kinds of thing that fit that description that we know of. Abstract objects, like a number, for example. They're not a material object, they're a concept. And also a personal mind. Doesn't have a material physical existence, but does exist. So these two are the candidates for what could have caused the universe. Well, abstract objects can't cause anything, can they? They're just abstract objects. Therefore, it follows that the cause of the universe, according to this argument, is a mind, a transcendent, intelligent mind. And so the cosmological argument gives us a personal creator of the universe. I hope I went through the blocks clearly enough there to reach that conclusion. So in summary, the cosmological argument gives us a personal creator of the universe, because it must have had a cause. And what else could be the cause? Moving on slightly from that to another reason why it makes sense to me to believe that God exists, and that is when you start looking at the universe. And apologies if you're not really inclined towards science and cosmology and those sorts of subjects, but it's a useful area to consider when thinking about whether it makes sense that God exists or not. And I'm just going to delve a little bit into the fine-tuning of the universe, because when scientists began looking into the laws of nature, they found that these laws could be expressed as mathematical equations. So, for example, E equals mc squared is the most famous maths equation, physics equation there is. And E is energy, and m is mass, and c is the speed of light. And what it's saying is that the amount of energy, E, contained in a mass m is equal to the product of that mass and the speed of light squared. So in other words, a phenomenal amount of energy contained within a mass, if it could be released. The constant there is c, the speed of light. It's a constant. It doesn't change. It's one of the physical constants of the universe. And it's not alone. There are many other physical constants. So things that scientists found to be constant and not variable. And whilst we might expect many of the constants of nature, such as the speed of light and the conditions of the universe, to be fairly precise, scientists were astounded to learn just how exact these conditions needed to be for the universe to exist and for life to exist. They fall into an extraordinarily narrow range of life-permitting values. Now, Now, I know this is where I need to see your faces, where I could see a bit of glaze coming across. And I'm just going to give you the headlines of this one, partly as well because it's something that we're entirely in the hands of the physicists and the scientists for. And also, I don't pretend to be able to understand all of this either, but I don't need to understand all of it to comprehend the argument that's being made. These constants have to be exactly as they are. Now, what other constants are we talking about? I'm not going to go through all of these. Don't panic. There's the speed of light, the third one down C. There's other constants in the universe, such as the gravitational force constant. And sorry if this is giving you flashbacks of your physics lessons at school. But these things have to be constant. The presence of the moon, large planets in the solar system, don't know how often you think about Jupiter, the planet, a large gas giant in our solar system. Jupiter protects the Earth. The gravitational influence that Jupiter exerts protects us from comets, asteroids, and so on. Not going to go into it hugely, but we have to be thankful for Jupiter. We like Jupiter. We love the way it looks on the photographs we have seen. Jupiter's probably our favorite movement from Holst's Planet Suite. But we have to be thankful for things like Jupiter. Without it, Earth would be bombarded and pulverized. There's many others, such as the strong and weak nuclear force, many others I'm not going to go into. But basically, with these constants, the fact is that if they were different, if they were just slightly different to what they are, minutely different, the universe and life wouldn't exist. So here's just a few headlines about that. Stephen Hawking estimated that if the rate of the universe's expansion had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million, the universe would have recollapsed into a hot fireball. Brandon Carter has calculated that the odds against the initial conditions being suitable for later star formation, without which, of course, planets could not exist and life on planet, is 1 followed by 1,000 billion zeros at least. And Paul Davies estimates that a change in the strength of gravity or of the weak force by only 1 part in 10 to the power 100 would have prevented a life-permitting universe. There are around 50 such quantities and constants present in the Big Bang, as they call it, which must be fine-tuned in this way if the universe is to permit life. And the conclusion that Davies came to through my scientific work, I've come to believe more and more strongly that the physical universe is put together with an ingenuity so astonishing that I cannot accept it merely as a brute fact. And Sir Fred Hoyle, who was an atheist, said, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics. It's difficult to explain this fine tuning. Last quote on this, I think, Robert Jastrow, the head of NASA's Goddard Institute, has called this the most powerful evidence for the existence of God ever to come out of science. Well, what other explanations are there for this fine tuning? And this is where really, it's something for you to look at if you're finding interesting, the fine tuning. Well, you could look at it and say, well, it could just be that it has to be that way, physical necessity. It could be chance. Just by chance, improbable things do happen. It could be just chance, or it could be that it's been designed that way. And probably already, the explanation that you feel suits best. You've already decided it's chance. You've already decided, well, it's just exactly how it needs to be. That's just necessity. Or you have decided it's by design. So this is what I'm saying about we come to philosophical conclusions differently depending on how we respond to these sorts of arguments. But I'm reliably told it can't be due to physical necessity because the constants and the quantities are independent of the laws of nature. They could be anything. String theory, we're told, predicts that there are around 10 to the 500th power different possible universes consistent with nature's law, independent of these constants. So could fine-tuning be due to chance? Well, the problem with this alternative is that the odds against the fine-tuning occurring by accident are so incomprehensibly great that they cannot be reasonably faced. The chances that the universe should be life-permitting are so infinitesimally small as to be incomprehensible. So the universe is therefore plausibly due to neither physical necessity or chance. So it follows logically that the best explanation is that it was designed that way. So what were we saying there? And if you're just tuning back in for the summary, that the fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe is due to either natural law, chance, or design. It's not due to either law or chance, therefore it's due to design. That's called the cosmological argument. Now, I really hope that you're still with me, because this really is what I want to talk about, and the main point I'd like to leave you with, because we don't need to know anything about science to understand this concept. This is something that we all know the reality of morality, or the moral argument for the existence of God. Now, there's an enormous literature on this, and I'm going to give you the most easily understandable version of it, or at least what I think is the most easily understandable version. What is it saying? Well, there are laws that govern our behavior. There are political laws, legal laws, laws made by nation states. Now, the government enacts laws which make certain things forbidden and certain things required, and these affect our behavior. So, for example, theft. The political law is that it's illegal, it's prohibited to steal property that doesn't belong to you. That's something that's forbidden. There are also political laws that require things like paying income tax, for example, or when a company is recruiting, you're not allowed to discriminate against people on the basis of their age and their gender. So when you're shortlisting and you get the CVs, you don't get the age and the gender, so that you don't discriminate, because it's a law that you can't. So these political laws exist and they govern our behavior. Well, where did these laws come from? Well, they were enacted by legislatures or monarchs, kings and queens, who have the authority to pass such laws, and those who live in that state have to keep them. Now, that explains how they came into being. But they're not the only laws that govern our conduct, are they? Because many people also believe that there are moral laws that bind individuals in the same way that political laws do. Now, what do we mean by moral laws? Well, for example, I am obliged to not lie to others morally. And similarly, I'm obligated morally to keep my promises. Now, there are no political laws about that. And I'm talking in the interpersonal sphere here. I'm talking person to person. I'm not talking about giving false testimony in a court of law. And I'm not talking about breaking a covenant and things like that. I'm talking about the personal relationships that we all have and the moral obligations we have not to lie and to keep our promises. Now, sometimes political laws coincide with moral principles, such as laws against rape and against murder. But there is no law saying that if you promised your school friend at lunchtime that you were going to meet him at the end of the day and walk home together, there's no law saying that you have to keep that promise. Likewise, there's no law that says that you can't tell your friend that your uncle is a millionaire when he isn't. You can't lie. There's no political law governing that behavior, and yet we feel that moral obligation, don't we, to keep our promise, to meet our friend and walk home with him if we promised we would, to not say that we have relatives with lots of money when we don't, not to just lie and break promises. Now, where do those laws come from? The political laws were given by a lawgiver. Doesn't it make sense that the moral laws would be given by a lawgiver as well? Well, who could that be? isn't it plausible that moral laws are grounded in some appropriate moral authority? And the only plausible candidate to fulfill that role is a creator, is God. Now, these laws must also have a lawgiver, and who else could it be? Well, just to re-emphasize some of this and bring it out a bit more. An American philosopher, Charles Evans, if one supposes that there is a God and that God wants humans to know him and relate to him, one would expect God to make his reality known to humans in very obvious ways. This is why we said at the beginning, I think it's possible to believe in God without argument, to know and have that belief. If an awareness of moral obligations is in fact an awareness of God's divine laws, then anyone who is aware of moral obligations does have a kind of awareness of God. Perhaps someone who has experience of God in this way does not need a moral argument or any kind of argument to have a reasonable belief in God. So these moral obligations, do they exist or don't they? That's the question. Well, they have a certain character, don't they? A special kind of force that we care about complying with them, and violating them incurs blame and guilt. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, if I make a maths mistake, let's presume I'm teaching a maths class, which I don't have to do, thankfully. But if I'm doing maths on a whiteboard, if that even still happens, and I'm doing sums, and I make a mistake, then I feel silly. Sure, I'd feel silly that I made a mistake, but I wouldn't feel guilt and I wouldn't feel shame. But I do feel guilty and I do feel shame if I put myself before others, if I'm greedy, if I'm avaricious, if I entertain immoral thoughts against which there are no political laws. Why do I feel guilty? Why do I feel ashamed if I break those? And on the positive side, there is universal recognition of things for which there is no law to keep either, such as self-sacrifice, such as courage, such as love, such as equality. Universal acceptance that those are very good things. And God's existence provides the best explanation of moral obligations. How else do we count for them? Well, evolution cannot account for morality. And there are attempted evolutionary explanations for morality. Now, just think about a couple of moral facts. And I'm not talking about heroic deeds of greatness, just simple things. I'm not talking about in 2018, do you remember when the asylum seeker from Mali in France, do you remember he scaled that building, the facade of the building, and rescued the 4-year-old toddler who was dangling from the balcony? Do you remember seeing that? It was incredible, wasn't it? I'm not talking about great deeds of morality. I'm talking about simple things like getting up to give your seat to an old lady on the bus, like donating blood, like volunteering your time and your money when there is a need, such as a famine or an earthquake. Now, if we are evolved primates who are programmed to survive and reproduce, why would we do these things? Well, the advocates of evolution put an argument forward and say that it's a form of extended selfishness, that it's genetic kinship, so that when a mother sacrifices her safety to save her children, she's doing that because they have the same genes. So what seems like an altruistic and noble deed is actually a cunning strategy on the part of the mum to make sure that her genes get into the next generation. Genetic kinship. You scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. A businessman might be nice to a customer, not because he wants to be kind, but because he's hoping the customer will give him money or whatever, reciprocal advantage. If I'm on a bus and an old lady hobbles in, she's not a relative, so genetic kinship doesn't come into it. And Neither does reciprocal advantage. I don't think, well, I'll give her my seat today because she can give me her seat next week. You know, it's not for that reason that we do it, is it? You give up your seat because you're kind, because you recognize greater need than your own. You donate blood because you want to help those who need it. You help strangers in a faraway country who you are not related to and who can never, ever repay you because you're kind and generous and you are sympathetic with their need. You know, these are the simple facts of morality in the world. When Mahmoud Gassama scaled that building facade to rescue the 4-year-old dangling from the balcony, he didn't do it because the 4-year-old was a relative of his or because he hoped that the 4-year-old might grow up and eventually pay him back, did he? He put his life at risk to save him. You can't explain that behavior. That's real. Objective morality exists, and it cannot be explained in an evolutionary context. What is the evolutionary and atheist explanation for all of what we've considered? The God explanation does a lot better. When we consider these things, God's existence provides the best explanation for moral obligations. If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. Theists and atheists alike agree on this point. The position of the modern evolutionist is that morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction. Any deeper meaning is illusory. And Nietzsche, the great atheist who proclaimed the death of God, understood that the death of God meant the destruction of all meaning and value in life. Peter Atkins, I see no evidence for its absoluteness. The ethics of a lion seem to be quite different than the ethics of an antelope. As for human beings, we're just slime on a planet belonging to one sun. You know, there can be no meaning because there is no God. But William Lane Craig says objective values do exist, and deep down we all know it. There's no more reason to deny the objective reality of moral values than the objective reality of the physical world. Actions like rape, cruelty, and child abuse aren't just socially unacceptable behavior. They're moral abominations. Some things at least are really wrong. Similarly, love, equality, self-sacrifice are really good. So in summary, if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Objective moral values do exist. Therefore, God exists. That's how that argument goes. They provide strong evidence, I do believe, for God's reality. Well, what have we been saying? We're saying that the God explanation for these mysteries is the best explanation, that it makes sense to believe that God exists based on these things. Why do we have a cell that shows a structure of complexity? Because the cell has been intelligently designed by an intelligent creator. Why does the universe show a complexity and rationality? Well, those are the characteristics of the creator who made it that way. Why is the universe so finely tuned for its existence and life? Because the creator finely tuned it that way. Why is there morality in the world? Why do we all feel, even when it works against our advantage, a moral law within us? Well, that's because there is a moral lawgiver who gave it to us. So when we put it all together, the existence of God, all of these mysterious facts, suddenly the light comes on. It provides an explanation that is better than an atheist explanation. So in conclusion then, we have, I believe, good reasons to think that God does exist. Together, these reasons constitute a powerful cumulative case for the existence of God. And if someone wants to believe atheism instead, then he must first tear down all these explanations and in their place erect a case of their own to prove that God does not exist. Unless and until he does that, I think we can conclude that believing that God exists is the more plausible worldview. Faith is an attempt really to grapple with the facts, to make sense of the data, to illuminate rationally the world that we live in and find ourselves in. And you might, at the end here, and I am going to finish now, I promise, you might, though, to all of this say, well, we just don't have enough data yet. You know, all these things that we're talking about, we're making progress in, we're making advances in, when all the data's in, we might have explanations, better scientific explanations for these things. Well, it hasn't come up with them yet. And besides that, there is also something else called the inevitability of human action. We have to decide, we have to act. We don't have an unlimited time in which to decide and to choose where we stand. And I believe that it makes sense to believe that God exists. Faith is a position that makes sense. Thank you for your kind and patient attention this evening.